Okay. So when we're talking about grief, it's not just life and death, but it's anything in life that has changed our path. So when you fail a course, it can be grief. When you move, it can be grief. When you lose a friend because they moved, it can be grief. Or change schools. Even if the school you're going to is awesome and amazing, if you're leaving other people, if you're leaving other connections behind, it can cause grief. So what I want you to do is on a piece of paper, and don't worry, you don't have to share this and you don't have to rip it up, so you're okay. I don't want to go across here. I want you to draw a line from birth into now. And I want you to take, we're going to take about 3 minutes to just kind of brainstorm all the grief processes that you have had. And I'm going to play a song while we do it so that it helps hold our time. If I can, there's no playlist. Okay, so, okay, I'm going to play this one. Okay, so what I want you to do on a piece of paper, write a line and think about all the times you have had grief alter you.
Said I was in my early 40s with a lot of life before me, and a moment came that stopped me on a dime. I spent most of the next day looking at the x-rays, talking about the options, and talking about sweet tonight. I asked him when it sank in that this might really be the real end. How's it get you when you get that kind of news? Man, what you do? He said, I went skydiving, I went Rocky Mountain climbing, I went 2.7 seconds on a full-length Blue Mansion, and I loved deeper, and I spoke sweeter, and I gave forgiveness I could deny. And he said, someday I hope you get the chance to live like you were dying. He said I was finally the husband. Most of the time I wasn't. And I became a friend would like to have. And all of a sudden going fishing wasn't such an imposition. And I went 3 times that year, I lost my dad. Well, I finally read the good book, and I took a good long hard look at what I'd do if I could do it all again. And then I went skydiving, I went Rocky Mountain climbing, I went 2.7 seconds on a full-length Blue Mansion, and I loved deeper, and I spoke sweeter, and I gave forgiveness I could deny. And he said, someday I hope you get the chance to live like you were dying. Like tomorrow was a gift and you got eternity. Think about what you do with it. What did I do with it? What did I do with it? What would I do with it? Skydiving, I went Rocky Mountain climbing, I went 2.7 seconds on a full-length Blue Mansion, and I loved deeper, and I spoke sweeter, and I watched the needle as it was flying. like we were dying. Live like we were dying.
Okay. So I want you to look at those that you've written down and think about which one of those are going to impact you as a nurse. Like, is there any of those griefs that haven't been dealt with yet? That when you walk into a patient's room, that are going to cause that heartache? We had someone earlier that said, you know, that they realized through talking today that they hadn't really dealt with the suicide side of life. And that's going to impact you as you walk into a room, right? We take all that baggage on us, all of our life's experiences, all the griefs that we've had, and we bring them up with us into a room, with those patients. And so it's really important that we look at that timeline and we realize where we are. Think about it. It will help you build empathy with those patients. If you're working with someone who just moved here, just moved from another country here, well, okay, I remember as a kid, I went to like 3 different elementary schools before I ever, you know, landed at one because of family dynamics and issues with that. And so like, I can dig into some of that grief, into some of that discomfort that I had going to so many different schools and empathize with the idea of moving. It's not going to be completely the same, but it'll help make me a better nurse by understanding where that heartache and where some of that pain comes from, and then being able to empathize with the patient that's in that bed. Okay, so understanding, looking at your grief timeline. Usually some of the first things are, you know, death of a pet. I don't know about you guys, like the death of my first pet was super hard on me as a kid. But then we have some people who've had very few things on their grief timeline, which means that's going to impact how when they go into that room, they may not have a lot. There's a speaker, and he's an interesting speaker if you ever get to see him. His name's Alan Wolfelt. He's a doctor. He'll tell you he's a doctor with lots of letters. And he'll tell you about his 75 books that he wrote. But he does have a good theory that a lot of people now, because we've hidden death, we've put end of life and stuff into the hospital and we aren't seeing it. It isn't part of who we are as much. We come very naked, especially our younger nurses. Like when you guys are working and you get an inexperienced nurse, remember, a lot of those new grads, they're coming in very naked to the bedside with very little grief experience, with very little end of life experience. And so it can really cause some trauma and some pain. Okay, look at that grief timeline and just, you know, at some point after we get through our emotional outpouring today, right? We get through this, look at it and just be like, what of these things have I dealt with? And what stuff do I still need to work on? Or what still hits a nerve? What still makes a visceral feeling inside me that I still need to deal with? Okay. I still smell, if I smell cigarette smoke, like I still smell like my dad. You know, when you're a pack-a-day smoker, that's how I connect him. So when I smell a patient that comes in that way, and so you guys do know, I still work as a nurse. I still work on the floor. I still work with patients, and I'll have a patient roll in that will have that same smell of COPD and cigarette smoke and alcohol and all that kind of stuff. And I'll be like, oh, yeah, I know where this goes. You know, like I know where that grief package is for this one. You know, so just thinking about those things. Experience is the best teacher, but not if we don't acknowledge the experiences that we've had. Okay, so every once in a while, take time to reflect on your experiences and your grief timeline. In America, we like our checklist, man. I know I got Amy on here. She likes our lists. She can cross them off, right? We like that because we know what we're doing. That's not how grief works, right? grief is very much a messy process. And we've all been taught this, right? The famous adage, denial, anger, depression, bargaining, right? Kubler-Ross, like the goddess of grief and grief management. However, she's been known to say she wished she'd never given a checklist to Americans. We like our checklist. Yep, I've done denial. Good. I don't have to go back there. Yep, I've done anger. I don't have to go back there. Yep, I've done depression and I've done bargaining. Good. I've hit acceptance, right? That's our last spot. I've hit acceptance. I've checked them all off. I am done. I am healed. That's not how grief works. I think grief works more like waves. Some are big and crush into your chest, and some hit your knees and you can jump them and have fun with them or whatever. And some knock you off your feet and push you into the sand, and some tickle your toes. Kind of like those little birds that you see like running back and forth on the beaches with the waves, right? That's how grief is. Grief comes in waves. You may be in depression one point and you may be bargaining the next, and you may be back to denial. Okay? Grief is not a sequence of events. So we have to really acknowledge that just because, and I think of grief as like leaving scars or marks or freckles or whatever you want to say. It leaves that on you every single time you have an experience. It leaves that kiss of grief on you. Okay. And so we really have to work with it. Don't work against it. Because the beautiful part about grief is where it comes from. Okay. This is an interesting that grief needs to turn into mourning. Grief is internal. It's our self. It's that response to loss. Okay. It's thoughts and feelings. It's very individualistic. Mourning is external. Mourning is the actions, and it's usually done as a collective. I went to a funeral I had a really rough, like 2018 into 2020. My cousin died unexpectedly, and we went to a funeral up in like Wisconsin, and I saw how much it was important for us to go through mourning, because her husband had wanted to do a very, what he called, organic funeral, where sort of like a wedding, everybody played a role, right? So I had my cousin, Anne, who passed away unexpectedly, her husband, Michael, who was trying to deal with everything, trying to work with us, which was great, very loving family. They had kids. But then I watched as he wanted everyone to have a role. And when it comes to grieving and going into mourning, we already have a role to play ourselves. We don't need to have a pallbearer, or not a pallbearer, but we don't need to have like a ring bearer and a flower girl and all that stuff like you do in a wedding where you have like 3 flower girls because you can't tell one person to do it. In the funeral, he had ended up giving everybody a job. And it's like we already had a job. Our job was to grieve individually, mourn collectively. And so I watched as the kids in the funeral were so confused because they needed to have that collective. They needed to have that wraparound. They didn't need to have a job of going and handing out the candles and going and handing out the flyers and the brochures and stuff like that. They already had a job. It was grieving, but it was treated more like a wedding where it was a celebration in that respect. So it's really interesting how important it is for us to mourn. And then I watched the emotional fallout that happened because those kids, their job wasn't acknowledged. They were given other jobs to do. So then they're just trying to be tough and do all this other stuff. So that's just something to think about, how important it is to wrap around that family. That's why you go, we do the food and we wrap around people collectively. There have been funerals longer than there have been weddings. Kind of an interesting thing to think about. We have grieved and mourned more than we have celebrated unions and connections. So not that the unions and connections weren't there. We just didn't need the ceremonies. but funerals have always been a part of our existence. I mean, you think about like elephants. Elephants have been known to go and play with the bones of their dead loved ones later after obviously they become bones. And so they mourn, they still mourn. So it's really important, and they do it as a collective, as a together pack. So it's really, really important that we do the grief for ourselves, but then we give ourselves that time to mourn. One of the other things that becomes really important to this is, and I know I'm probably going to get hate mail for this, I'm not a huge fan of celebration of life. I think it confuses what we're supposed to be doing. It's not that we can't celebrate their life. It's not that we can't love the life that they had. But the people that say put fun in funerals are meant to be sad. They're meant, we need that space. We need that collective okay to be sad and to miss someone. When we start saying celebration of life, or we don't want any tears, or we don't want any sadness, or any of that kind of stuff, we're not allowing that human nature, that pain and that hurt, a safe place for it to go. So that's something to think about as you're working with families that are planning funerals, or as you're planning your own, that you need to give space for that messy, emotional stuff, that muddy turmoil stuff, so that it has a space for healing. Because we're seeing a lot of complicated grief happening because people aren't allowed to grieve and mourn like we need to process through it. So just thinking about kind of those processes. So let's talk about why we grieve in the first place. What's the purpose of grieving? We grieve because we love. So I talked about, I think someone said, earlier, like, do we look hard or whatever because we don't cry for every patient? No, you're not going to love every patient. You're not going to have a connection with every single patient. If I had a connection with every single patient that I've seen die, man, I would be a depressed person, because I've seen so many over my years. I've been a nurse over a decade, and I've seen so much loss. I can't bleed for them all. But do I have my handful, or larger than a couple handfuls of patients that absolutely take my breath away? Obviously, I still talk about them and I still cry, right? I still get teary-eyed when I think about these patients, because there was a connection there. There was something that they meant something to me. We connected on a personal level. We connected on a spiritual level. We connected just because we had things in common. Whatever it was, we connected, and when that connection got lost, you hurt. We grieve because we love. This is why pets can be so intense when you lose a pet, because that pet was everything, right? That pet was who you saw every single day. I mean, I'm sorry, I got kids and no one wags their tail when I come in except my dog, right? Like, my dog is happy to see me every time I walk in that door. I don't have to have food in my pocket. I don't have to have money in my wallet. She loves me no matter what, and loves when I come in that door. So that's why that when we lose a pet, when a pet dies, that grief can become so intense, because they're our companion. We love them a lot. When we're mourning, there's 6 needs that we need to, and this is from Dr. Alan Wolfelt's theories of he calls it companioning grief. He talks about that we need to acknowledge the reality of the death, right? So that's getting through that denial phase. We need to acknowledge that reality. We need to embrace the pain of loss. You guys, we suck at this. We want to run away from the pain of loss so bad. We run away from every bit of pain that we feel, right? I get a headache, like my shoulders hurt right now, so I went and took Advil. I mean, just to that level, we run away from pain, period. Instead of being like, why is that pain? Pain that comes with grief serves a purpose. And it's important that we recognize the purpose that it serves. So think about that when you're trying to get away from pain, when you're trying to get away from the hurts. There's a reason it hurts. Okay? It's not always bad. Sometimes we just have to let it happen and we have to let it work through us. We need to remember the person. My grandma Young has been gone, oh my gosh, probably almost 15 years. And we still sit around and we talk about her, right? We still sit and we remember her. Okay? The pain today is a lot less than it was 15 years ago, but we remember the person. It's so important. We want to develop a new identity. So when you think about like moving, when I talked about that I moved 3 times before I was 10 years old, I had to create a new identity each time. I had to re-identify who I was, especially in the school system, you know, like, oh, in this classroom, who am I? Am I in the smart kids? Am I in with the cool kids? Am I in with the nerds? Am I in with the quiet kids that just don't want to talk to anyone? Why am I here? What's my identity? We have to search for meaning. Okay, we need to search for the meaning of why it happened. This may or may not happen. Sometimes life just gave you a bad deck of cards and it happens. But that search for meaning or what it means to have lost that person. And then ongoing support. And we kind of really suck at this one too. You know, you'll be like, oh, well, they died a year ago. You're still hurting from that? Guys, grief and mourning do not have a length of time. And remember, we talk about those waves. So for 6 months, those waves were nice and little and I could handle them. And then all of a sudden the waves come and they crush me in the chest and it's 6 months and 1 day later. And people are like, oh. We need to make sure we're willing to listen to people when they come and they're like, I don't know how to deal with this. And things will make it happen in their face. I remember I had a patient one time that was like having a panic attack. And I was like, what is going on? Why are you having a panic attack? And they said, I'm in the room next to the room where my dad died 3 years ago. And in the hospital, they just had gotten randomly placed in the room right next to the room where their dad had died. And so that caused such anxiety and such grief to swell up. We have to remember that those things happen and we have to work with patients and stuff, you know, and I had to sit there and listen, commit to sit, okay, when people are going through it, that ongoing support. Grief does not have a timeline. The only way out is through. There's some really good TED Talks. If for people that know me know I'm a TED Talk junkie. The only way out is through. And there's a woman that talks about how you don't get out of grief, but you walk through it and you get to the other side and you live with it. And kind of like I talked about, like grief kind of kisses you and it stays there. And it's forever there with you. It's how we work with it. It's how we acknowledge it. That becomes really important. Okay. And kind of what we talked about a little bit is why does our grief history matter? Because we bring it with us every day. Every time we walk into that patient's room. And there's going to be triggers. There's going to be patients that trigger you. So if we can figure out what your triggers are ahead of time, you can start working with them so you can acknowledge that that is there. So thinking about those kinds of things, understanding where you are on your grief journey and your timeline is really, really important. All right. So just thinking about go back to that like timeline and be like, what of these things is going to trigger me? What kind of patient would trigger me to go back into a grief session or a grief wave if I walked into that room? And just being really self-reflective. Okay. All right. So that's kind of the down and dirty and skinny of grief. Let's close that. Okay. Whoops. Are there any questions so far? I kind of went through a bunch of stuff. If you've got some questions, if you want to put them in the chat, you sure can. Am I still sharing my screen? I sure am. Okay. Kind of give you a spot to take a breath. We've had some heavy stuff going on. It gets a little easier after this. Okay. Flo messaged me. Flo, did you want to share your story? If she's listening. Oh, she may not be here listening right now. Oops. Okay. I want to take another break.
It's a video.
Oh, is it a video?
Yeah, I was trying to upload it like and send it to you, but it's on YouTube.
If you want to, do you want to put the YouTube link in the conversation, and then people can watch it?
Okay, let me try to do that.
Okay, yeah, just copy the link and put it in there, and they can copy it out and kind of watch it here after a bit.
Okay. Cool.
Okay.
All right.
How long have we been going? We've been going. Why don't we take, I'm gonna get set up. Why don't we take like a quick 10-minute break? So it's 2:24. Let's take a 10-minute break. So 2:34 or 2:35. Don't sign off your computers. Just stand up, stretch, wiggle, go get a drink, go to the bathroom, whatever you need. And then we will kind of start with the tail end of this day. All right. So don't log off. Just go stand around, take a break. If you want to turn off your camera, you can, but
Meet Ali Bennett.
screen share and share it here. I'm recording. Okay. So when I talk about conversations really being the start, they are. So I was taking care, this was over Christmas, and I had a physician that I was working with, and we had a patient that had a massive stroke, was completely flaccid on one side, and nonverbal. And he was about 70, maybe in late 60s, early 70s. And he had gotten a brand new PEG tube. And we had already had issues with him. He'd pulled out like 3 NGs. He'd pulled out like 4 IVs. He pulled out everything he could. We had restraints on him. And it was just not working. So they put a PEG tube in him. Well, guess what? Literally, he had that PEG tube for maybe 6 hours, and he pulled that out. Like, he was one of those that you put in restraints that can get to anything. And so I talked to the physician, and I said, you know, we both know that he is probably not going to survive this, and that the stroke has taken out his swallow. The problem when we take out our swallow is that we no longer can control the secretions that are in our mouth, and we still make them. And so all those secretions are then still going down. And now we're going to go into our lungs, and we're going to die probably of aspiration pneumonia. That's if we're even allowed to get to that part. But we knew his probability of surviving for a prolonged period of time was not most likely going to be good for him. And so this doctor, oh my gosh, it was just such a mess. He called the family, couldn't get a hold of the POA or the main person. And I don't know what on God's green earth this man said to this family, but they come into me and they are a wreck. I've got a wife that's like, I was at work and I don't know what's going on and it's an emergency and blah, blah. And I'm like, no, this is not an emergency, but we do need guidance. And so the doctor then starts to tell this family, who's already stress level here because of whatever he told them over the phone, stress level here. then proceeds to tell them and look at his feet and tell them, well, he's been pulling out all his tubes. He on a bell curve of 150 days, he's probably going to die, but it might be somewhere on this side of the bell curve and it might be somewhere on this side of the bell curve. Mind you, the whole time he's standing over them. He's staring at his shoes. Unfortunately, he has an accent, so he's hard to understand. But he doesn't acknowledge that, it keeps going. And so I kind of stepped in and said, hey, have you guys talked about his wishes? Have you talked about what he would want? And he shushed me and pushed me to the back. And he continued to go on with this family and stress the crap out of them. And so they said, no, we want everything done. We want everything done. We want everything done. Problem with that is we've already put so many tubes in this guy that he's pulled out. So now we have a 70-year-old man who's had a massive stroke that we all know is not going to probably make it for a long period of time. We all know that he's eventually going to get aspiration pneumonia and probably die from it, if not having another stroke at some point in time. Okay. He now has to have IVs put back in, which already took us 2 or 3 pokes to get the ones in that he did have. He now has to have an NG placed because he'd pulled out the Keo feed and it was so new that we could not, or not the Keo feed, the pig tube, he'd already pulled that out and it was so new that the track hadn't healed. And so we couldn't put another one in for risk of it leaking. He'd already pulled out 3 like Keo feeds and NG tubes. So we were gonna have to put a new one in with already trauma, nasal tissue and sinuses. And we were gonna have to restrain him. So this 70-year-old man who could not speak, got a feeding tube through his nose, again, got more pokes for IVs and was in restraints. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a pretty horrible way to die. And it all because the conversation was handled so horribly. Now, we could have had a great conversation with them and the family still may have chose to do those things, right? But how can we judge a family if we haven't even given them the basics and the tools to make decisions correctly? So we're going to talk about the conversation. It's broken down into 3 really simple parts, guys. And you do this as nurses all the time. So it's really 3 simple parts: relationship, facts, control. All right. Really 3 simple parts for having any intense conversation, but we're using it for end of life because it's one that I know you're going to have. Okay. Relationship, build a relationship, give them facts, and then give the control back to them because it's their body and theirs to control. So relationship, when you enter that room, this is why how you walk into a room is important. You walk in with nice clean scrubs, hair pulled back, stethoscope on, shoulders back, looking the part, right? You're playing the part of the medical provider, the nurse, whatever. You walk into that room, you've got calm energy, you are there, okay? Your body language, I think I read a statistic that showed that, what was it, like 93% of what we communicate comes through body language and tone of voice. That means there's a whole lot of stuff that words are not conveying. And so it's really important that we are very appropriate with our body language and our tone of voice. Energy, I have found to be always a huge piece of it. If you come in one with a confident energy and one with not a chaotic energy, if you come in with a chaotic energy, you're going to get chaos back. Okay, I've seen this. Like when I've had to have end of life conversations, they haven't all been like in nice little cubicle rooms off to the side. I've had conversations at the bedside while I'm doing chest compressions. Okay, there are conversations we have to have in minutes notice. All right, so that's something to think about when you're having a conversation. The energy you bring into a room. If I come running into a room and say, oh my gosh, this is going on, this is the problem, this is what's ever, okay, I'm going back, right? And I run. Right there, I've created chaotic energy, okay? I've pushed that onto them. When you have a disheveled, horrible day, and everybody is allowed a Monday, okay? When you go in that room, you just gotta be like, man, I'm just having a Monday. Like today, I was just like, man, I was getting frustrated, but It's just tech issues. Like, we'll figure it out. We gotta, you know, we kind of paused for lunch and rebooted. Sometimes we have to just take a little pause, okay? We have to manage that relationship with people, and we manage it with our communication and building a relationship with them. This is where that connection becomes so important with families. They will overlook you saying something stupid, or you saying maybe something a little inaccurate, or you saying something and the doctor saying something differently, if you have a relationship with them. If you don't have a relationship with them, they think you're a yutz. Okay, so like, make sure that you are building relationships with people. The last piece is word choice. When you come in, use simple words. All right. I know we have to be able to read in the chart the big fancy words and break them apart and understand them. We have to be able to understand those words for NCLEX. When we are working with a family, they do not understand. When he told the family that the patient had dysphagia, they didn't know what that meant. Right? I mean, he may have gone in and explained it, but they didn't know what they meant. He has trouble swallowing. He can't control his saliva, and it's going to get into his lungs and cause him pneumonia. Easy. Not he has dysphagia, you know, especially when we start throwing in our acronyms and all this other kind of junk. We just have to really be careful of our word choice, because we can so easily switch into that medical jargon mode. That's a completely different language. And when people are in stress mode, they're not hearing all that stuff. They're hearing very simple things. Keep it simple with your word choices. Facts paint a picture, all right? Paint a picture of what's going on, right? Go back to the pathophysiology, go back to the disease process. Here's the thing, as nurses, yes, we can absolutely piss off doctors because we actually educate our patients and their families about what is going on. So yes, they can still get mad at you, but if you stand firmly on the facts, I didn't tell them that they needed a hospice consult. I told them that there were maybe better ways to manage the pain. You know, I didn't tell them that you're a moron of a doctor, but I did tell them that maybe we need to look at this, this, and this, or maybe here's something, okay? Make sure that you're always going back to the pathophysiology. If you have a COPD patient, you know that COPD is eventually going to get to the point where they can't breathe. We know that's going to happen, right? That's COPD. That is the trajectory and the pathophysiology of the disease. Eventually, you'll probably need to be on some nasal cannula oxygen. After that, you're probably going to, as the lungs get harder, more full of secretions, we're probably going to have to start talking about at what point do we want to continue treatments? Where's our line? Okay. A doctor might come in and say, you told my patient they're going to die. I educated your patient on the trajectory of their illness. Okay. I love it when I spend like all night with a patient and talk to or with the families and like, hey, like I had a guy that was he was on vasopressors, which means his cardiac system was failing. He was on a ventilator, so his respiratory system was failing. He was minimally responsive, so our neuro system was failing. And he had a Foley and just all hooked up to everything. And I go talk to the family. This is what I'm seeing. This is what I'm seeing. This is what I'm seeing. Here's the pathophysiology, this. Doctor comes in, takes like 2 seconds of a look at him, says, oh, he looks like he's doing better, and walks out the door. So that's what family hears. Oh, he's getting better. It was the renal doctor. The Foley was working. Like the patient was making urine. The reason the patient's making urine, because I have this guy maxed out on like 3 pressors that are pumping blood through the kidneys that are finally making urine now. But the cardiovascular system's still damaged, the respiratory system's still damaged, and the neuro system's still damaged. None of those things are fixed. I'm sorry, but you can't live without those 3 systems, okay? They gotta work, all right? So talking to people about their pathophysiology of their disease process and the disease process, that is always firm ground to stand on. You can always educate patients on what they're going on. The last piece you do is you give control back to them, okay? We are a very autonomous culture. And even if a culture is a collective culture, They still want to have control over their loved one or what's going on. You may have to give information to different people depending on their culture, but we have to give control back to them. If we know they have the facts, we have to let them make those choices. Okay. This could be your patient. This could be as simple as your patient that is on hospice and you gave them washcloths. You gave them something to have control over. This can be the patient that you're actively doing chest compressions are, and you ask them, do you want us to continue? Okay. It can be all sorts of different things, but we have to make sure that they have the facts before they make their choices. Okay. So giving control back to them, giving them a choice, somewhat makes them feel better. Even if some of those choices aren't real choices and they're just like, you know, ones that look like a choice for them. Do you want to do washcloths or do you want us to do Tylenol? Well, I mean, we can do either, but most of the time they'll pick the washcloths. Okay, so giving people, keeping it simple if you can. It can be really hard to keep some of this stuff simple, but we can do it. You know, I mean, there's been many times where I've been doing chest compressions and I'm like, or someone is, and I go out to them and I say, do you want to see them? Do you want to see what we're doing? And that simple choice, that simple act of dignity to give them that choice, they respect that. So making sure that we're giving them that when possible. Things to stay away from. Oh, these are my irritations. They make me tense up and get hangry or angry or whatever. Okay, so we're gonna stay away from everything. When I ask you guys, do you want everything? If I was gonna buy everybody a pizza, we had such a hard day, we all need to emotionally eat. I'm gonna buy everybody a pizza. Do you want everything on your pizza? What are you gonna say back to me? I don't know about you guys. I do not like anchovies. I do not like pineapple. I don't know why people put pineapple on pizza. Fruit does not belong on pizza. Personal opinion. But I don't want everything. Or I'm gonna ask, what's everything? Okay. In the medical world, people don't ask it. They just are like, okay, yeah, I want everything done. If your heart should stop, do you want us to do everything? Do you want everything done? Well, yeah, I want everything done. Because the opposite of everything is nothing. And people they don't want nothing, right? They want something done. That's why we have to get away from these terms that are so divisive. That's this or this, this or this. That's a bunch of malarkey. There is so much more in the middle there. These are end choices. There's so much more that's there for us for options. Because the other thing that we need to stay far away from, and I hear doctors do this, there's nothing more we can do. Well, that's a bunch of BS too, because there's always more we can do. We can change focus. We can start giving we can talk about quality versus quantity. We can talk about how we're going to take care of this person. Because when we say there's nothing more we can do, or do you want everything done, if people have an either or choice and there's nothing in the middle, there's nothing in between. Okay. I watched this happen to my grandma when she was like 85 years old. She, the nursing home had called us, or not nursing home, the assisted living had called us and said, hey, you probably need to take her in. She's been super dehydrated with the flu and GI bug, whatever. And so we took her into the ER thinking I'm not a nurse at this point in time. I'm a CNA, probably dangerous enough to, probably knew enough to just be dangerous. But I like went in and was just, I remember seeing that her heart rate was 20. And I was like, what is going on? And I said, she's a DNR. She's a DNR. She's a DNR. By the time I got to the third time I said she's a DNR, the ER nurse had already slapped an external pacemaker on her and cranked her up to 60 beats a minute. She was awake with her heart rate at 20. So then the doctor comes in and she asks, like, because he's like, you have to have a pacer. And she's like, well, do I have to? And he's like, well, if you don't, you're going to die. And so in the way he said it to her, in her Christian mentality and thinking, she thought it was suicide if she didn't do it, because she was choosing to not get everything done, then it's suicide. And so they ended up putting a pacer in her, and she lived another 5 years and eventually died of a brain tumor. But those 5 years weren't very quality years. You had a woman who was blind because she had macular degeneration and was a librarian and an avid crossword puzzle doer. Okay, you take away somebody's vision like that, that's a pretty horrific way to spend the last 5 years or so of your life. So just because we can do stuff doesn't always mean we should. And we've got to stay away from the idea of everything or nothing, because there's a whole lot of middle ground in there that we're missing when we do that. And people don't hear it, not in those intense moments. So think about what's the middle ground and find ways to change your words. So where do we start? So we start with, and I love this sentence and I call it my back pocket question. What do you know about? Okay. What do you know about pacemakers? What do you know about heart failure? What do you know about COPD? What do you know about your dad's disease? Okay. Asking people what do they know about, one, buys you time. So if you're kind of in an oh crud moment, you're like, oh crud, oh crud, oh crud, what's going on? You go, but what do you know about CPR? What do you know about? Will buy you time. It's kind of interesting. When I did my master's research and I posted it on Facebook, because that's what we do, you know, get all excited about stuff we do. I didn't honestly expect anything to come out of it. Well, I had a friend message me and say, hey, can we meet? And it was somebody from high school who I hadn't seen for like 20 years. So I was like, okay, this is gonna be weird. It's like awkward. But so I went and met with her, and she goes, I'm a manager of a cardiac cath lab, and we're being sued right now. And I said, okay, well, so far I'm not seeing what I'm helping you with here at this point in time. And she goes, our doctor, a patient died on the table, which, I mean, why do people go into a cath lab? They're having a heart attack, like actively having a heart attack, right? So not totally uncommon for someone to die there. So she said that the doctor went in with the nurse into the waiting room and said, he didn't make it, the nurse will take you back, and left. And that is how the doctor told that family that their loved one had died. So I was like, okay, so you want me to talk to you about how to have end of life conversations? And she's like, yeah. So we talked about a few things. I gave her a couple little tips, talked to her about just the simple sentence of what do you know about? If the doctor had gone in and said, what do you know about your dad's disease process? And if they had said, oh, we know that he's had 3 heart attacks, he's had open heart surgery, he's had all these things done, you know where you're starting. Or if they said, we don't know, he just all of a sudden grabbed his chest and fell over, you're starting at a very different spot. So come to find out, a few months after I'd talked to her and given her some ideas and tips and thoughts, she messaged me again and said, hey, unfortunately, and I'm like, oh, okay, it didn't work, whatever. She goes, unfortunately, we had to use some of your advice. And I said, okay. And she goes, they brought us cookies and a card. Same end result. Patient still died. By changing our words, we changed the grief, we changed the hurt, we changed the anger, just by simply letting people have some dignity and understanding that people are at different spaces. The doctor said, what do you know about your mom's heart? And they said, oh, we know this, this, and this. And they said in their card to them that they felt so well respected and valued as part of that team for that healthcare. So just by changing our words, just by switching how we say, it's the same thing. We're saying the same thing, but by how we say it changes the impact that patients have. Another one to use is to change focus. So instead of aggressive treatment, we can change focus on quality and time. We can change focus and ask them what they want their focus to be on. Especially if people are scared of the word hospice, it changes focus on pain control, right? Do you want to keep doing chemo, or should we change focus and focus on enjoying the time you have left? Okay. That changing focus is one I use a lot for hospice conversations, because people, they hear hospice and they hear giving up. Like, that's immediately where brains go now. Hospice, giving up. We know that hospice does not mean giving up. Hospice does not mean suicide. Hospice means allowing a natural disease process or path to happen. But what people hear is death. So changing focus can help people realize, kind of get you into that hospice area or into those comfort cares, kind of a backdoor way that helps people understand better what our real priorities are. The other thing I like to do is, I was part of the Med Center when we started bringing families into the room during a code. Now, this can be good and bad. There are implications for this. But if we're bringing family into the room, there has to be something very important with them. There has to be someone to talk to them. Okay? You cannot bring a family into the room if they don't understand what's going on. Could you imagine what a family would see if we are all actively doing chest compressions, bagging someone, all this kind of stuff, and we all stand back? Okay? That family isn't going to see that we're scanning them for their AED's doing its path and doing its detecting, or they're getting ready to shock, right? The family's not going to see that. They're seeing all of a sudden all of us stopping and standing back. I really loved at the Med Center, we had some really, really good pastoral care. And they would stand with the family and explain to the family what was going on and why we were doing what we were doing. Because remember, what they see is Grey's Anatomy, House, all of these shows. What really happens is very, very different. And so it's really important, if you're going to bring family into the room, which research has shown that it shortens code time, because they're seeing us do everything. They're seeing what a code really looks like and how traumatic it really is. So it's okay to bring family into the room, but it's important that you either, I mean, not all family, guys, there's some family, if you've got a family and everybody's up on meth, probably not the best family to bring in the room while you're doing it. And you only may bring in one or two. The rooms are packed during codes, okay? But it's good for families to see what's going on. And that way you're not running back and forth trying to tell them, oh, we got their heartbeat. Oh, we lost their heartbeat. Oh, we got their heartbeat. We lost their heartbeat. Okay. So it's really, if you're going to bring families into the room, we have to be able to almost do a debrief. Could you imagine if families saw us put an NG tube down during a code? They'd be like, why are you putting a tube down his nose? That's not going to help him breathe. Well, when we bag people, we put air in their stomach, and we need to decompress the air out of that stomach. Otherwise, we're going to get vomit and aspirate all over the place. Okay. So it's really, really important that we have these conversations with families, that we ask them, what do you know about? And I promise you that will buy you time if you're trying to deal with a situation where you've got, you know, the son from Texas who hasn't seen mom for 10 years, and then the daughter at the bedside who's been with mom every day. We got to catch him up. So, you know, it buys you some time. What do you know about your mom's disease process? What do you know about what's gotten us here? You know, what do you know about your mom's wishes? That question, what do you know about, will buy you some time to figure stuff out and see where you're starting. If you say, what do you know about your dad's disease process? And they're like, well, I know he's had a cabbage a couple years ago. I know he still ate hamburgers and smoked, and I know that probably wasn't helpful for him. I know he's been on like a whole handful of cardiac meds. That's very different than if you get, well, I know he had heart surgery a few years ago. It's like, wait a minute. Those are two very different starting points. Same patient, different starting points. And one's going to take a little bit more time to get caught up. Okay, so that will buy you some time. I really like this thought, and I love the idea of a door. Being courageous doesn't always mean climbing a mountain. Sometimes it means addressing the issues everyone sees, but no one will talk about. Patience will open doors for you, and you have to walk through them. If you ignore them, if you shut those doors, they won't open them again. And while death and end of life is a very private, vulnerable human moment, having these conversations with people are private, vulnerable moments too. And so you'll have patients that want to have conversations with you because you're a nurse. That title right there somehow bypasses so much other stuff. We are trusted. We are like, what, for 17 years, we've been the most trusted profession over doctors and clergy and all these other people. Nurses are so valued and so trusted. So it's really, really important that when we have these conversations with people, that we walk through those doors. They'll open them for you. You just have to be willing to walk through them. Let's see if this video will play.
Disney Plus, Hulu, and ESPN Plus team up. Oh my God. Epic stories.
Genocide.
Oh, that one skipped forward. Let me share. Why is it not optimizing? Weird. Okay.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in a 1968 speech where he reflects upon the civil rights movement, states, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." As a teacher, I've internalized this message. Every day, all around us, we see the consequences of silence manifest themselves in the form of discrimination, violence, genocide, and war. In the classroom, I challenge my students to explore the silences in their own lives through poetry. We work together to fill those spaces, to recognize them, to name them, to understand that they don't have to be sources of shame. In an effort to create a culture within my classroom where students feel safe sharing the intimacies of their own silences, I have 4 core principles posted on the board that sits in the front of my class, which every student signs at the beginning of the year. Read critically, write consciously, speak clearly, tell your truth. And I find myself thinking a lot about that last point, tell your truth. And I realized that if I was going to ask my students to speak up, I was going to have to tell my truth and be honest with them about the times where I failed to do so. So I tell them that growing up, as a kid in a Catholic family in New Orleans, during Lent, I was always taught that the most meaningful thing one could do was to give something up, sacrifice something you typically indulge in to prove to God you understand His sanctity. I've given up soda, McDonald's, French fries, French kisses, and everything in between. But one year, I gave up speaking. Figured the most valuable thing I could sacrifice was my own voice, but it was like I hadn't realized that I had given that up a long time ago. I had spent so much of my life telling people the things they wanted to hear instead of the things they needed to, told myself I wasn't meant to be anyone's conscience because I still had to figure out being my own, so sometimes I just wouldn't say anything, appeasing ignorance with my silence, unaware that validation doesn't need words to endorse its existence. When Christian was beat up for being gay, I put my hands in my pocket and walked with my head down as if I didn't even notice. Couldn't use my locker for weeks because the bolt on the lock reminded me of the one I had put on my lips when the homeless man on the corner looked at me with eyes up, merely searching for an affirmation that he was worth seeing. I was more concerned with touching the screen of my Apple than actually feeding him one. When the woman at the fundraising gala said, "I'm so proud of you. It must be so hard teaching those poor, unintelligent kids," I bit my lip because apparently we needed her money more than my students needed their dignity. We spend so much time listening to the things people are saying that we rarely pay attention to the things they don't. Silence is the residue of fear. It is feeling your flaws gut-wrench guillotine your tongue. It is the air retreating from your chest because it doesn't feel safe in your lungs. Silence is Rwandan genocide. Silence is Katrina. It is what you hear when there aren't enough body bags left. It is the sound after the noose is already tied. It is charring. It is chains. It is privilege. It is pain. There is no time to pick your battles when your battles have already picked you. I will not let silence wrap itself around my indecision. I will tell Christian that he is a lion, a sanctuary of bravery and brilliance. I will ask that homeless man what his name is and how his day was, because sometimes all people want to be is human. I will tell that woman that my students can talk about transcendentalism like their last name was Thoreau, and just because you watch one episode of The Wire doesn't mean you know anything about my kids. So this year, instead of giving something up, I will live every day as if there were a microphone tucked under my tongue, a stage on the underside of my inhibition. Because who has to have a soapbox when all you've ever needed is your voice? Thank you.
So I like that because I think as nurses, we have the ability and the space to meet people in those silent spaces, to meet them in those moments where things happen, where they have that vulnerableness that makes them uncomfortable to talk. But we have the ability to meet people there. We have the ability to walk through that door with them, for them, beside them. And so I think it's really, really important that we take advantage of that time and that space that we are granted as nurses, to have those conversations and to have those important moments with them. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna give you guys time to practice having these conversations. So let me see if I can do this. I don't know what you guys, kids are home from school. Stop screen share. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, because we still have our breakout rooms. No, we don't. Okay. Okay, we still have our breakout rooms. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you guys, I'm going to read a story, and then I'm going to put you in your breakout rooms for 5 minutes. And so you'll get 5 minutes to discuss how do you do the relationship? How do you do the facts? And how do you give control back to that family or that patient with this scenario? Okay. Where'd it go? My breakouts, they're there. Okay. And I'm gonna make sure I have everything at my fingertips. Okay. Let's do this one. We'll start with this one. So it's 3 in the morning. You are charting at the workstation in the hallway. A patient's wife comes up to you, tears streaking her face, nose red and runny. The family and the patient had been given a grim or poor prognosis of the disease and given the different options. She holds her tears and sobs in long enough to say, "I don't know what to do." All right, I'll read it one more time and then I'll let you guys go to your breakout rooms. It is 3 a.m. You are charting in the workstation in the hallway. A patient's wife comes up to you, tears streaking her face, nose red and runny. The family and the patient had been given a grim or poor prognosis of the disease and given the different options. She holds her tears and sobs in long enough to say, "I don't know what to do." All right, so head to your rooms. 5 minutes. Set a timer. assigned. Okay. Weird. They didn't assign everybody. There, everybody should be going.